Hey all, my name is Dr. Joseph Hammer, and I just got done reading The Complete Researcher by Doctors Joshua Hook, Don Davis, and Daryl Van Tongeren. And I took some notes and marked some passages that I thought were really excellent and are the sorts of things that I want to hold close to my heart and ingrain in my long-term memory. And so, having just read through it, I'm going to go through and pick out a few things that really spoke to me and that I wanted to hold on to. And I was going to share it with you all as well, in case some of these ideas spark curiosity or interest or feel valuable to you. And if so, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book for yourself, where you can get the in-depth context of that. So I'm just going to kind of touch on key pieces, pausing in between, and we'll string it all together. So here we go. So in the first chapter, it's called Finding and Sustaining Your Motivation, Connecting Your Values to the Research Process. And I liked that this was the first chapter because it emphasized how you need to be clear on your why when it comes to research in your professional role. Because if you know and feel intrinsically inside this thing you're trying to do in the world, what itch you're trying to scratch, what good you're trying to create, what you're trying to live up to, that's very helpful in guiding you in making decisions about what you'll study and how you'll study it, both content and process. And I thought that was really nice. They talk about how the values provide the energy and the motivation for the actions, and they speak to the thing that a lot of us as professors tell our mentees and graduate students, which is graduate school is a journey and it can be a slog and very daunting. And so you need to find and sustain that energy to keep yourself at it. You need to believe in where you're headed and the work that you're doing to make the slog and the rigor feel okay to move through. And how if you are disconnected from your values and the ultimate why, it makes something that's already very difficult really, really difficult. And that is certainly true for research. And certainly sometimes, particularly when we're not in a lead principal investigator role, and so we're supporting somebody else in their research, in those supporting roles, you have less, perhaps, say in what the research is about, but the more that you take the lead, the more you have the power to determine what you'll study and why and how you will study it. And it is super important for you to be intrinsically interested in that thing that you're studying, because extrinsic motivation of, oh, I need to get a publication, or I need to pass this program requirement, or whatever it is, that can only get you so far and for so long. But really, you need that intrinsic motivation if you're going to sustain a multi-study program and research on something. And this is something that when I look back over the course of my training, I think about some of the scholars I grew up around, where I saw them taking risks, being intrinsically value driven, and doing the deep investment in their skill set and their program of research that help them build momentum over time. Whereas for me, I freely admit to the people I talk to, my students and other colleagues, that I took a very safe approach when I was in grad school and I determined that I wanted to go be a professor. I worked backwards from, okay, what does my CV need to look like to get a job? And um, how am I going to publish and get grants and that sort of stuff? What do I need to do to get a job, to get tenure, all that sort of stuff. So I was pretty strategic, and I prioritized learning to play the game. And I made choices about what things to study, in part based on what could lead to a reliable scholarly output. But it wasn't always doing like the most important or juicy or fulfilling or foundational work on that topic that I could have. And so I invested in some tangents and some roads that might have led to more concrete, easy uh, things I could count on, publications to ensure that my CV was strong, that would facilitate that next career step. But I forewent, I put off some of that deep investment in myself in terms of figuring out like what are the big risks, where the uncertain outcomes, where this work or this program of research really speaks to me. Um, Even that if it's going to go slow and it might take several years for it to start to bear fruit, that felt very risky for me. And so I chose to play the game more. And I have some regrets about that. And, you know, my life is my life. It is what it is. But sometimes I think about, had I been principled and completely values driven right from the beginning, what sort of arc my research program would have taken. And so I like that they lead this book with that chapter. And then the next chapter here is on building community as you build your research career. And in this section, they have a subsection called Build Multiple Communities, where they say that we rarely get all the community and support we need from one mentor or group, which is really good because it really does take a village of mentors to ideally raise a student or a professional. And so being able to have different mentors whom you can get overlapping, complementary support in terms of emotional support, in terms of instrumental support, skills, feedback, that's a really lovely idea. And same with, they talk about social support in terms of the community of people that you find connection with, and the social support and the life outside of the work-life balance, and the importance of having connections beyond those people in your academic community, because it's nice to be able to disconnect and step out of that, to not always be tempted to talk shop and talk work. And I like that they name that uh, developing community takes time, that there's no way to shortcut the process. It takes investment, and you can feel underfulfilled or underconnected until you've put in the time and energy where the relationships bear fruit. I remember when I moved to Lexington here for my faculty job, where it took several years before my partner Melissa and I felt that sense of homeness and community and connection socially here. And we, as humans often do, had little worries and doubts and uncertainties about like, oh, we don't yet feel connected. When will that happen? What was that need? Will it ever happen? And inevitably it did, but it required that time and investment. And then there was no shortcut to that. So I like that they named that. And one of the things that I appreciate about their book is I have the sense that for themselves as researchers, for some of the communities they came from, including social and religious communities, and in some of the graduate students who they tend to bring into their research teams, that there can sometimes be some socio-political, moral, ethical values differences in terms of how we see the world and how we think about what fairness is and what values priorities should be. And so I really liked, and this, I don't read this as often, they talk about that balance between being true to oneself, one's home community, one's home cultural values, and being willing to be challenged and explore and grow, and sometimes shed things that may no longer fit for you in terms of community or values. And how that can be a really difficult process, but one that's super important to be open to. So that that resonates with parts of my experience, but probably that was less rough for me, and that I think a lot of my worldviews and values were probably pretty well aligned with the counseling psychology as a field that I went into. But I really like that they're explicitly naming this, and there will be some more later in the book in terms of the cultural humility of creating a big tent and welcoming everybody into the space, and then practicing that flexibility and that ideological diversity that I thought was really fresh and helpful to read. So I'll speak to that in a bit. In chapter 3 on building expertise and research, they talk about the importance of adopting a growth mindset, which we believe our skills and proficiencies can be cultivated, and how that's reliably related to better performance across a wide range of outcomes. And I will admit that I definitely have a strong streak in me where I like to feel competent and good at a thing, and I jealously guard my time and my investments, particularly as I grow older. And I have this aversion to sunk cost where I invest in a thing, but then it doesn't bear the fruit or the outcome that I'm hoping for. And then I'm like, oh, I spent all that time and energy and money or whatever on this thing that never bear fruit. I dislike that inefficiency so much. I joke with people that one of my love languages is efficiency. And so it's easy for me to be like, I want to stay in my lane. What skills do I have analytically, research wise? How can I reliably use those to do projects? And a hesitation to invest the necessary time and take the risks of learning a new skill set or approach where I will be slower productivity wise, but it's a necessary investment in my growth and it embodies that growth mindset. And I think I I in some ways wish I was intrinsically more of a growth mindset person. I admire people who are, and I think it's a very healthy personal development aspiration to try to grow more into that growth mindset where you're allowing yourself the grace and time to build into things that feel uncomfortable or new or that might not bear fruit for a while, because you believe you're worth that investment. I think that's a nice idea, and that concept of deliberate practice in building that skills is talked about here too. And something that sometimes obvious, they talk about the zone of proximal development and how deep practice is best occurring in the edge of your ability so that you're not sitting on your back on your credentials, you're not being uh you're not resting on your laurels or being unchallenged, but you're in that zone. And I think about this a lot with mentoring, where ideally the things we're asking of students is within their stretch zone or stretch goal, where they can do it. It's not so overwhelming and so far from their current skills that it shuts them down and is paralyzing, but it's also not uninteresting or boring because it's so within their skill set that they're not growing. And so I think in terms of scaffolding opportunities to make sure people are taking on more and more advanced things over time, and that idea of that zone of proximal development is really helpful for that in terms of thinking about mentoring. And that's true for us too, where if we're setting ourselves up to try to take on learning a skill or we're expecting too much too soon of ourselves, how that can just lead to paralysis, and how can we right size our growth expectations for ourselves, I think is good. And they're talking about multitasking as a myth. Absolutely. And for a lot of us, we tend to be most alert and do our best work at a certain time of day. And for me, that's morning. So that definitely helped me, where it was so hard for me to stop always checking my email and working on email. And I was much more overall productive when I focused on writing, which is the most complex cognitive task for me. Love to write in the morning when I'm most clear-headed. And then in the afternoon, when I have less bandwidth and focus, I can still teach really well. I can still respond to emails and do busy work stuff, but it's harder in the afternoon for me to do the hardcore writing and research stuff. So appreciate that they mention that. And in chapter 4, they talk about setting goals for your research, breaking goals into small chunks, setting SMART goals, but not getting too focused on goals at the same time. And they name how this is something I can remember doing. Some people avoid working by setting more goals, such as writing and rewriting to-do lists when they're stressed rather than doing the work on the list. And I can remember times when that was true. And the importance of creating positive rewards for yourself to reinforce that, and how some people do the what's that method called, where you're on for 50 minutes and then off for 10 minutes or something like that, to purposely break up and reward yourself for stretches of focused time. Uh, the Pomori method or something like that. I just looked it up. Pomodoro, 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. Yeah. And I will say, in thinking about myself as a mentor with students and creating research goals, the biggest things that stand out are how it's so true that when it's too big of a goal, that leads to paralysis and people don't do any work on it. And so the importance of training people as new students into how to map out a larger goal into a set of smaller sequences and steps, and identifying a non-scary, actionable next step chunk that they can work on that has a clear deliverable where it's clear, it's measurable. Did you succeed or not? That's definitely been a hugely reinforced for me as a mentor lesson in terms of helping students with that. So that's certainly key. In this next chapter on developing good habits for successful research. And one of the things I like about this book is that they do a good job of speaking to the process, articulating the hidden curriculum of like procedures, processes, and philosophy about how to set yourself up to do this research work well and in a productive way. And they talk about the importance of practicing time management in terms of if you don't control the time spent on various activities, the time it takes to do something will fill up the space you allot it. So it's important to decide ahead of time how much you're going to invest in that. And if you don't protect your time, other things will naturally capture your attention and you will never do what you want to in life. And that is so true and so hard because I've gotten better at predicting how long it will take me to do things. Usually I've just learned when I say, oh, it'll take me X hours, I have to double or triple or quadruple it. That's the big lesson is that it always takes more time than I think. And one of the reasons why I just, intrinsically hate setting deadlines for myself is because a lot of the times it can be hard for me to guess how long stuff will take. And it oftentimes takes much longer and it doesn't help that I'm a perfectionist. And so it can be hard for me to just rough draft something that's really rough, but then I have something and then I can go over it and massage it, make it better. I have this tendency to want to, like, as I'm writing, composing something, to have everything above my cursor be perfect. And then as I get down, then I would go back up and it's just so slow because I'm trying to perfect everything rather than just get it down and allowing the imperfection. That's always been a continued growth edge for me. But I really do like this emphasis on the importance of protecting your time and learning to block out your schedule for like, I will do work in this and then I'm going to put it down. And by giving yourself a tight deadline, it also increases the motivation of like, this is the time I've allotted to do this thing. I'm going to do what I can do. It helps you hopefully not get stuck in the perfection of trying to do something so well, because that of course will take much more time. And so if you know you only have a limited amount of time, then it can right size your effort and level of polish for that. And so I think that is really healthy. And I also love this sentence here. They said another great benefit of taking control of your schedule is that you are not at the mercy of what other people want you to do. When someone asks you to do something, instead of responding right away, check your schedule. If your schedule is planned out ahead of time, you can honestly respond and say you have another commitment, even if it is a self-care activity. And then you can suggest another date or time that works for your schedule. And that's really healthy, right? So if your schedule, your work time and your playtime and self-care is scheduled out, you can know what you're currently investing in. It's concretely there in your schedule. And you can see you don't have more time to take on something new. And so you can answer people honestly, and it gives you cover for saying a polite no to opportunities. And it also helps you, I think, get in the habit of being much more choosy about what new things you take on, because a lot of times we don't realize that there's only 24 hours in a day. And for everything we say yes to, it means we're saying no to future things. And that is really important. And so there's a sacrifice, there's some zero-sumness in terms of our investments. And so it can help us be choosier and more careful with that. I really like that they named that. And that third habit of completing your three most important tasks first. And it makes me think about that 2x2 method of like urgency, very urgent, less urgent, important, less important, and how people can get stuck in the less important stuff that's original. In terms of like procrastination is easy with that less important stuff. And we tend to neglect the important stuff that's not yet urgent until it becomes very urgent. And then we're cramming and such. And so if you can be disciplined about doing your most important stuff, which for those of us who are in grad school or early career where research is a component of what we're expected to do, usually it's research that gets neglected. And so that blocking out time oftentimes, and if you think clearly in the morning, blocking out morning time for writing and research and treating that as sacred and not letting things creep in is definitely directly related to your ability to be productive and get things done with research. So I really respect that. And habit 6, group similar tasks together. So to that reduce context switching, the inefficiency of getting oriented when you switch between things. Like I'm really bad at keeping my email open. So when I hear the ding, I really want to hear check what the email is to see whether I want to respond to it right away. But there's a cost to doing that because it takes my attention away from the thing that I'm working on. And it can lead to me procrastinating on that stuff I'm really supposed to be doing. And related to email, talk about treating email like a task to complete rather than something that spreads into all spaces. So it has its time and place, like you pick out an hour or two to respond to emails, usually in a time where it's not optimal writing time. And that's where you do that. And then you set it aside and then wait for it to the next day. That rather than having something that's spread into all aspects of your life is really healthy and so hard. And honestly, I can read all I want about this stuff, but sometimes it varies. Like if you're a program director or there's other time sensitive things, there can be some costs to not being attentive to your email throughout the day. And so at this point, I try I tend to have it open and will check when something comes in, but I try not to shift my full focus to responding to emails unless it's something super time sensitive or it's my afternoon time that I designate for email. So I want to have a sense of what's coming in, but when I'm being most disciplined, I won't switch off of what I'm doing to attend to and respond to that. So that's my compromise. I could be better about it, could have it completely closed and not look at it, but I'm not there yet. Don't know if I will ever be there. I also thought it was really cool. They talked about how long does it take to form a habit? The average number of days of doing a behavior before it became habitual was 66 days in this research that they cited. So it takes a little over 2 months of doing something regularly before it starts to feel like second nature. And so that's a good level setting for us when we're trying something new. And we're like, okay, I'm going to do this new healthy activity or this best practice way of organizing my time. And then if you only try it a few times or a few days and you're like, it's just not working, throw it out. That's too early. You haven't given your mind a chance to get habituated to that. So I think that's a healthy level set. And in the graduate mentor corner of this book, they talk about how for mentors, it can be easy to assume that a lot of these like best practice habits of research and time management are something that people should have mastered and come in with as basic study skills. But I have learned over time that like people are where they're at, and a lot of us don't have the luxury or the privilege to have been in spaces where we had the opportunity or the training or the mentoring or the attention or the resources to be taught these things. And so even though it can feel tiring for a professor at a graduate level to have to train students in these things, that is our job. And any mentee deserves to be met where they're at, just like I wanted to be met where I was at when I was under the tutelage of mentors. And so it's just something that professors might like me just have to come to peace with, and that like if not us, when will people learn it? And ideally they may have picked it up early, but they may not have. And there are a lot of times there are structural reasons rather than like personal integrity reasons for that. And so we don't want to blame people for something that's ultimately a systemic issue. And if we want to create betterness, we should be the ones to help guide people through that mentoring. So that's a helpful reminder for us as mentors. And they make the good point about how oftentimes people can earn good grades despite having poor work habits, and that can get them through all the way to graduate school, where finally, when they're faced with something that takes more than a few months, like a big research paper in a class, like it takes multi years, like a thesis or a dissertation, that's when the wheels can fall off, when that that approach of just getting by and cramming for it and whatever just will no longer work. And so sometimes this is the first moment where people are faced with the necessity of developing these skills. And I thought that was a really, really astute point. And in this next chapter on cultivating positive beliefs to foster research success, they talk about how observing successful experiences is helpful, but that there can be limited utility in, say, a new graduate student watching a seasoned research mentor do something because the difference in skill and experience between the mentor and student is too large. It can end up being discouraging because students can feel like, oh, I should be picking this up, but that gap is just too big. And so they talk about antidotes being it's essential for research mentors to lead with vulnerability, talk about what it was like for you when you were a graduate student, and be open about your resume of failure where you did not succeed or get something right. And that is really, I think, reassuring to people. And it's just like how social media, if people may portray just these overly rosy positive aspects without the struggles and challenges, it can lead the people looking on the outside, seeing like, oh, their life looks perfect, they're so put together, they have it all figured out. It sets up these unreasonable expectations that can lead to paralysis and can make it difficult to grow. And so I appreciate them naming the importance of us talking about our struggles and such because of how that can normalize and reassure. Yeah. And related to that, it's essential to develop a close-knit lab where graduate students can learn from each other, see and celebrate one another's successes. And that pairing of two people at a closer developmental level, I think can help that zone of proximal growth where you're being pushed just beyond your comfort zone and learning those skills that are a little bit beyond yours, that grad student to grad student mentoring, especially if you have a team where there's a real pay it forward cultural mindset that you've been able to create and cultivate, that I can see that really helping. And that classic piece of feedback of balancing corrective feedback with positive and encouraging feedback. It's like mentoring 101. And yet it's so easy for me to slide into that mindset of like, well, I'm just going to focus on the things that they need to do better and focus on the corrective stuff without adequately taking the time out to praise people and name what's going right. That's something that continues to be a growth edge for me. And so it's always really helpful to be reminded of the importance of that balance. And they have a quote later in the book about where they cite the relationship researcher about how positive, healthy relationships were defined by a ratio of 5-to-1 positive interactions to negative interactions. And so the importance of having that positive praise and that positivity to provide balance for the constructive feedback, the negative criticism is necessary for the whole thing to work. So I thought that was good. Something else on page 81 that I put a big star next to, and I remember there was I was in my master's program, I was trying to figure out like repeated measures ANOVA or something that was just so beyond what was appropriate for me to try to independently study to learn. And I wasted so much time my Thanksgiving break trying to figure out how to do this analysis. And what I needed to do was I needed to have a mentor who could provide that statistical support to me. And I didn't quite in that moment, but it made my life so much harder. And so I appreciate that they said, reach out for help when you get stuck. Some people hit a barrier and stop, and it grinds to a halt. We never want people spending hours spinning their wheels. And that is so true. I try to emphasize to my students, and I hope I create the conditions that allow us to do this, where it's like time spent should be efficient. You should know what you're doing or in that zone of optimal development where you're being pushed and challenged. But if you're into paralysis mode, if this is too far, you don't have what you need to be able to do this, and you're trying to figure it out on your own and it's not clicking in a reasonable amount of time, you need to stop and connect with help and use that efficiency of your mentors and people to help you get unstuck, because it's just not worth it to try to beat your head against the wall. It's wickedly inefficient. So I appreciate them naming that. And on page 82, they say, make it normal for students to not know, and make sure they understand it is okay to ask questions about anything. which is really healthy because there can be this expectation, especially if you've gotten to a doctoral program because you're deemed ready for graduate school. There can be this pressure to feel or show or demonstrate that you have all the things that one must have foundationally as a student. There can be less excuse to be still learning and growing. And so I like that it's important for mentors to normalize that there is inevitably stuff you're not going to know that you're going to need help with. So let's please not pretend. We shouldn't create this pressure where students feel like they have to pretend that they know something when they don't, and then all the inefficiency that can rise from that. And then there, chapter 7 on nurturing the mind-body connection to support productivity, this is such an important chapter for graduate students because, and I'm guilty of this mindset too, where I oftentimes can bring this hardcore mindset to my own self. I don't as much put this on other people. It's mostly put this on myself to me, where I'm like, sit down at the computer, grind it out. If it takes you 8 hours, whatever, get it done, which neglects the fact that my mind is this manifestation of my body and its functioning. I can't think clearly and be productive and work smartly if I'm not fed, rested, exercised, all of those things. Like I like efficiency, and I can work most efficiently when my body is taken care of, when I've eaten, when I have enough sleep, all of those things. And not taking care of your body, how it can just make everything fall apart and lead to this sense of false economy where it's like, well, if I do these all-nighters, then I will be more productive. But we oftentimes discount the cost that comes with that. And of course, the big dilemma is that people rightly identify how it is so hard in graduate school to have time for all the things. It's impossible in some ways to do all the things, and there are deep structural issues that account for this. And so this whole like the importance of self-care, are you taking care of yourself? It's a very tricky discussion because students rightfully note that structurally it's so difficult for us to be incentivized and allowed to take care of ourselves. And so, yeah, you're saying take care of yourself in these ways, but are we allowed to? Do we literally have the bandwidth to? And so there's a lot of good debate there. And of course, what do you do when you're embedded in a system that's not optimally healthy or set up for good work-life balance? Like, you must find a way, just like graduate students from all generations past across degrees of personal privilege and marginalization have figured out, where we all must find our way to survive, and ideally it's in ways where we can be taking care of ourselves. And it's always important to acknowledge the huge challenges that structural issues in terms of the well-being of graduate students, how that makes it super hard to actualize that, particularly for students who are not in that most highly privileged category in terms of their social location. I thought this was a really great, they had a section here on flow where they combine several of the ideas mentioned previously. It says, we discussed 6 practices to put yourself into a flow state where you can do that great work and that research, get your physiology right, know your peak time, remove distractions, single task rather than multitask, check your level of difficulty, and alternate work and rest. So these are all themes that I had named previously or were mentioned previously. So it's a really lovely packaging it all in one really good list of things to do. So that was nice. And then in chapter 8 on navigating adversity during the research process, they talk about this concept of building some margin into your life so there can be a buffer when unexpected stress or hardship occurs. And that means not always working at 100% capacity. It means working at like 80 or 90%, so you have some extra room to accommodate unexpected difficulties or challenges, which means setting boundaries and planning for how you can cut back. And this is something that Dr. Davis, I have always heard from him in this or that space. It's like there's no mission without margin, or there's no margin without mission. And I always associate that with him. And I had never quite heard that that before, and I really like that because it does increase the importance of like the idea of not operating at 100%, because when any little thing goes wrong, it all goes downhill and there are serious costs across the board. Instead of the idea of building in a buffer, again, going back to that self-care discussion and what structurally is allowed. So to the degree that we can, and we can be savvy in the face of these difficult odds and barriers to being able to engage in self-care, that the degree to which we can build in margin is a wonderful idea. So I really appreciate that they name that concept so that people get out of a mindset of like, okay, am I at capacity because that's where I should be and that's what I am obligated to be as a graduate student, to like, well, what does it mean to build in margin and to value that and to believe that I deserve that and to choose to take on fewer things to make sure that margin is maintained is good. And so this section on maintaining trust on page 99 is something that really dovetails nicely into something that I and a lot of fellow counseling psych faculty in our discussions, we've been talking a lot about in terms of the concept of professionalism and making and fulfilling commitments. And it really ties into the heart of some of the stuff we've been really thinking hard about, especially as generationally, we all age and grow up and new generations join us in academia and they have fresh perspectives on what is healthy and reasonable around this. And so there's a lot of like soul searching that I've done in terms of like, how should I think about this? What should be my values? What should my expectations be of students? And I like that they say that trust is earned through making and keeping commitments. So when you face adversity, it's important to negotiate your commitments right away. So that's important that when, despite your best efforts to maybe try to build in some margin, for example, to your life, the inevitable things of life happen and you can't fulfill your commitments. You're not a bad person when that happens because it's inevitable. But what makes one more or less professional, or who can build and maintain that trust or lose that trust, is in how you communicate and respond in that moment. Do you proactively or as timely or in as a timely a manner as possible negotiate your commitments, discuss appropriate accommodations, and see what's possible? Because faculty can accommodate, and there's this quip of like, if you communicate, we can accommodate. And so we love to accommodate because that's important. We need that accommodation when we're in the difficult position, but communication is the fabric that makes that possible. It's the prerequisite, it's the foundation of it. And so how you can maintain trust by being active and proactive in negotiating those commitments and communicating when stuff comes up, rather than going radio silent or letting the felt shame or anticipated shame just have us ignore it or try to do it or go to 110% to try to make it all work in a way that's probably not, and it's all going to blow up, like avoiding that. So I really love that they named that. And they name a thing that we've all heard at some point, and myself included, really emphasize, which is finishing graduate school is not a race. I tell my students it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so I would rather them slow down, create more margin, recover, accommodate, whatever, take fewer classes, take an extra year off, leave of absence, whatever, maintaining. So you say, but sometimes this is the best solution, stepping back, reducing commitments is the best solution to help students maintain their mental and physical health through times of adversity, because the crashing and the burning and the burnout is way more detrimental and will stop you from being able to complete the marathon rather than the slowdown. The slowdown can be accommodated, right? But the reaching the breaking point, much more costly consequences. So it's much, much better to accommodate and go slower than to crash and burn. So I appreciate them naming that. And I think it's always, this part here is always healthy that they say on 102, if we see drops in an important implication is to extend students the benefit of the doubt. If we see drops in performance that do not have a specific explanation, they may be due to circumstances which we do not know about. which is really true. And it's a really healthy thing for every mentor or collaborator to keep in mind, is giving that benefit of the doubt that there's often an explanation for that. And of course, everybody needs to be accountable to maintaining that trust by proactive communication. And, you know, people are stressed, graduate school is hard. There are oftentimes it's important to hold that benefit of the doubt. So actually having seen the amount of time that it took me to highlight some of these things I really liked in these first 8 chapters. So that was the, they divide the book into 3 sections. The first section being building yourself into a successful researcher. So covering those 8 chapters, highlighting those things. It's probably a nice place to wrap up this video, because they have a section 2 on planning the research project from start to finish, which is about those applied pieces. And the third one is program, developing leadership skills and jumpstarting your research career. So perhaps I'll do a second video on section 2 and a third video on section 3. That might be a good way to do this. But yeah, have really loved this book, and hope that some of my commentary on some of these things that really resonated with me spoke to you, gave you some good ideas about things you want to think about, and importantly, got you excited to pick yourself up a copy of this book for yourself, so that you can learn the how of putting these things into practice and thinking about them contextually for your own life. So yeah, thank you to Doctors Hook, Davis, and Van Tongeren for writing this great book, which I myself have gotten a lot of great ideas from and reading as a early career, almost mid-career professor who likes to do research and mentor students. And so, yeah, hope this was sparked your interest in this book, and got you thinking about your own practice and the potential mentoring that maybe you are or will be doing with grad students. And perhaps we'll see each other in the next video, where I reflect more on other parts of the book. Thanks.